Good morning, everyone. As people are populating, we'll probably have an influx of people, so you'll hear me say this maybe a couple of times. My name is Juliana Barabbas. I'm with the International Qualitative Research Toolkit out of the University of British Columbia, Okanagan, located in Kelowna, BC, in Canada. It's a pleasure to be part of this webinar this morning in cooperation with ATLAS.ti and the School of Education Inquiry Methodology at Indiana University. We are so pleased to have everyone joining us this morning, and I see participants are slowly arriving. This is great. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started, and that is to say that we will be taking our and hello, Jessica, I see you. I see your hello, good to see you. We'll be taking questions through the Q&A panel. I'll be reading them on your behalf at the end of the presentation. We will be running about 40 minutes on this presentation time, 40 to 45 minutes, after which we'll be taking your questions. If you have any technical issues, if you can put them in the chat, but if you can put your questions into the Q&A, that would be appreciated. We'll have some introductions here when we come to the top of the hour. I'll briefly review this again for the last minute attendees. It is so wonderful to have you all joining us today for this webinar. So we're now coming up on 9 o'clock. For those of you just arrived, again, the Q&A will be running at the end of the webinar in about 45 minutes. If you can put your questions into the Q&A box that's located at the bottom of your Zoom panel. It is such a pleasure to be in collaboration with ATLAS.ti and School of Indiana, our Indiana University School of Education, along with the University of British Columbia, where I am located. Again, my name is Juliana Barabbas. I'd like to introduce one of our partners at ATLAS.ti, who is attending on behalf of our director from ATLAS. Andrea Voicu is the project coordinator for training and partnership development for ATLAS for US and Canada. Andrea, would you like to say a few words?
Absolutely. Thank you, Juliana. My name is Andrea, and I am happy to welcome you to this session of Qualitative Methods Masterclass Webinar Series on behalf of Neringa Kalpokas, Director of ATLAS.ti Software. I am very pleased to announce that this series of webinars is organized by University of British Columbia and sponsored by ATLAS.ti Software for Qualitative Data Analysis. The International Qualitative Research Toolkit offers two webinar series, Explorations in ATLAS.ti and Insights in Qualitative Research Methods. Through this series, we highlight innovative approaches and practices in qualitative data analysis with ATLAS.ti and in qualitative methods in general. We strongly believe that sponsoring this project can help others, researchers around the world, with their research projects. Before I give the microphone to Juliana, I just wanted to announce a few things about ATLAS.ti. If you're interested in learning the software, we have a bunch of free webinars on qualitative research, literature reviews, and ATLAS.ti in general. And finally, because you are participating to this event, you deserve a special discount coupon for courses and licenses. Just drop us an email and we will be happy to share with you. The email address is training@support.atlas.ti.com. Without further ado, Juliana, the microphone is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And just to answer one of the questions to whoever was asking that if video will be put into the archive, yes, absolutely. This partnership for both the ATLAS or for both the Insights and Explorations webinars, we do have on our IQRT website at UBCO an archive with slides and videos. And of course, Vivek and Tran have kindly agreed to provide a slide deck as well with references, actually, for today's presentation. That'll go up in the next 24 hours or so. So after the presentation, please do feel free to share that archive with others who may be interested in attending. Our presenters today, what a pleasure to welcome Vivek, Vellanki, and Tran Templeton. Vivek is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Research on Race, Ethnicity, and Society, and a visiting assistant professor in the School of Education, Indiana University, Bloomington. Vivek's scholarly and artistic work are centered on issues of migration, transnationalism, and youth identity culture. He uses visual methodologies and research creation to question the boundaries between scholarly and creative work. Tran Templeton is an assistant professor of early childhood studies at the University of North Texas. Tran uses qualitative image-based methods to study young children's co-constructions of their complex cultural identities as told in and through their photography, play, and literary practices. Please welcome and enjoy Making Images, Visualizing Worlds.
Thank you so much, Juliana and Andrea and the team for putting this webinar together and inviting Tran and me to share our work. We're really excited to be here with all of you, clearly streaming in from all parts of the world. It's always a pleasure to be in conversation with scholars, thinkers, educators from everywhere. So thank you for being here and thank you for taking this time. Our presentation today is called Making Images, Visualizing Worlds, and we're hoping in the next 40 to 45 minutes to just talk a little bit about our research, but also before we go into that, talk about why we should be looking at the visual, and we'll offer a very, very, very brief history of camera technologies and visual methods, just to situate how those two sit together with each other. Tran will do a little bit more in-depth description of one of her ongoing image-based research projects with young children. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of my own methodological explorations with a young photographer named Urja. And we'll end hopefully with a very brief provocation, thinking about the future of image making, as well as analysis and some other questions as we're thinking about this work as researchers and educators. So first, to start with, like, why look at the visual at all in our research? And I think there's obviously some of the most more obvious reasons, which is if your work in any way centers visual media. And I think in our current moment where we're inundated with the visual in our everyday life, whether that's in the forms of photographs or video or other visual media, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, we're surrounded by it in all ways. The other thing is that visual also allows us to see distinctive aspects of research that other forms of data do not afford. And here we're particularly thinking about print-based or text-based data that gets a primary importance in qualitative research, either in the form of narratives or surveys or other forms. So the visual allows us to see things in a slightly different way than the textual or print-based work. You'll see from Tran's work that visual also allows us to get a deeper understanding of social, cultural, and spatial dynamics in a way that's very different from print-based or other forms of data. And then what is important for both Tran and I, and you'll get a sense when we talk about our individual works, is that the visual allows us to get a sense into the participants' worlds, into their own sort of subjectivities and how they think about the world, how they see the world, and how they engage with the world. And finally, the visual can also be a very important tool for researchers to think about their own practices, either while they're in the field or during the process of data analysis, data collection, and also reporting research. So again, those are some broad points, and there might be some that are not included here that are also important considerations and something to think about. Before we talk in more detail, we just want to highlight some brief considerations when we're thinking about visual and vision. Vision is not an isolated system, and I cannot stress this enough, in the sense that it's always working in collaboration and tandem with other ways of knowing and being, other senses, whether that is touch, smell, sound, movement, and other forms of knowing. So it's always in relation to it. It's not an isolated system. Again, Tran's work and my own work looks at how children and young people definitely see differently from adults. They see, sense, and are in the world differently. And so this is also important for us to keep in mind as we're thinking about the visual in qualitative research. And finally, even as we think about what the visual allows us to do, both Tran and I are stuck by the limitations of the visual and also how oculocentric much of qualitative research is, how vision-based it is. And as scholars of education, both Tran and I also think about how schooling is so very ocular-centric. So vision allows us to see things, but it's always partial, and it's only one way of knowing, seeing, and being in the world. And then finally, something that we have to stress multiple times with our work is that the visual, whether that's in qualitative research or visual practice or visual engagement, really encompasses many different forms. However, in our work, we are focusing on two very specific approaches: photography and other image-based approaches. Throughout this presentation, you'll see some photographs that we've either have been created by some of participants from our own research studies, or we've adapted from artists and other public websites. Wherever you see these images, we've tried to provide attribution to them. And so what are some common types of visual data that people usually use and work with when they're thinking about image-based and photographic practices? There are three broad categories. One is historical and archival images, which are basically images that have already been made or exist. And again, these could have been collected by institutions, libraries, museums, or individuals, families, communities, etc. The photograph that you see on the slide is a photograph from the Family Camera Network, which has done amazing work on family archives of photographs. Do check them out. If you Google the Family Camera Network, you'll be able to see their amazing scholarly and artistic work. The other category is researcher-generated photos, which are basically photographs that have been created by the researcher for the purposes of research. And the last one is participant-generated photographs, where research participants are invited to create photographs and then share them in the process of research. These three categories sometimes can be separate, but don't necessarily have to be separate. Sometimes they might be overlapping. So this is very much a very brief classification, just as a way to think about some common types, but it's not that they're distinct, separate entities, and they can definitely overlap. Before we get into sort of the detail of methodology and how we think about visual methods in our own work, a very, very, very brief timeline of camera technologies, I think, would be important to think about the work. Again, I can't say this enough. This is very, very brief, but I think we thought it's important just to situate the work. So camera technologies, as we know it and understand it and use it, are less than a couple of centuries old in both human life and also in thinking about the kind of influence that they've had in our social, cultural, and political spheres. In the late 19th century, when they were first developed, they were a very niche technology that was only accessed by largely upper middle class, ruling class folks. But over the past 50 years, we've seen a proliferation of this technology across contexts and situations. When we think about camera technologies and trace some of this history, we have to remember that the history of photography is essentially a history of colonialism. Its early use was in the service of documenting, recording, and classifying the lives of colonial subjects, enslaved people, and other marginalized folks who were often considered less than human. The scholar and writer Yvonne Vera writes that the camera has often been a baleful instrument. In Africa, it arrived as colonial paraphernalia along with the gun and the Bible. Unfortunately, this is also where the origins of visual methodologies in social science research are situated and located. Early visual work in these fields formed the basis for racist and sexist quasi-science of anthropometrics, phrenology, etc. The images you see here have been created by the artist Carrie Mae Weems in the series titled "From Here I Saw What Happened and I Cried." Carrie Mae Weems interestingly uses these images that were created early on, but flips the narrative about them and helps us think about some of these complicated histories and how people are being represented and what we get to see and not see. As camera technology was sort of developing and moving in the middle of the 20th century, other interesting things were also happening where people started documenting lives and showing people's lives that were not privy to large groups of the world. So Louis Hine, as a documentary photographer, is an interesting example of a person who was able to use the camera to document the lives of children who were being forced to work under dangerous conditions. Louis Hine's work would then lead to a number of policy shifts, but also shifts in thinking about childhoods and how young people are perceived and seen in society. It is around this time, with the proliferation of camera technologies, that visual sociology and visual anthropology took shape in the 1950s, starting around there. The widespread availability of this technology really allowed researchers to engage with the medium and also brought its circulation of these photographs into much more common practice: portraits, family images, etc. And this real early work, like with the example of Louis Hine, was influenced by documentary and artistic photographers. So another sort of foundational text in this field is Coulier and Coulier's Visual Anthropology, Photography as a Research Method. Now, sort of going back to the timeline that we started by looking at in terms of camera technology, you can see how visual methodologies were impacted by the proliferation of camera technologies. So 1950s, when photo elicitation, which is an interview process where photos are used as a way to lead subjects to talk about what is in the image, or use that as a starting point to describe it somewhat simplistically, became very common in the 50s and beyond, which is when photographs as objects became much more common around the world. And then photo voice, which over the last few decades has really changed and shaped the landscape of visual research in education and public health, became much more used in the 1990s and beyond, when camera technology was really became affordable and accessible by a much larger population of the world. And interestingly, now we're at a time when all of us are using and carrying cameras with us in everyday context, either in the form of smartphones, computers, or just under the surveillance of cameras that exist all around us. So when we think about visual data collection and analysis from those perspectives of either photo elicitation or photo voice, again, there are some broad categories that one could think about. One is the idea of a researcher-led process of collection and analysis, where the researcher is the one both creating the images, but also analyzing the images. And then there could be something that is designed by the researcher, but informed by the subjects of the research. So photo elicitation is, again, a good example where the researcher might decide what photographs to show and then have subjects respond to those images. And a third category would be subject design and subject led, which is research subjects are actively involved in not only what gets researched and how it gets researched, but also how the analysis happens. A good example of this would be participatory action research that informs photo voice projects. And again, these three categories are not distinct categories. There's often flux. And as you hear both Tran and I talk about our work, you will see how some of these things overlap and shift. So I'm going to hand it off to Tran, and she'll share a little bit about her work.
Thank you, Vivek, for framing our work for us. We're going to talk a little bit now about two of our research studies to elucidate the ways that visual research can even be muddy, as Vivek suggested in the last slide. We're going to start with my image-based research with very young children. And I recognize that many of you might not be doing research with very young children or visual research at that. I hope that aspects of this approach can be helpful to you. So this subtitle on this slide, "Whose Voice Is It?" speaks to one way that we understand images, Vivek and I, that is, and that is cameras not only produce visual stories, but also complex forms of voice. So my research with children is provoked by this proliferation of photographs of children taken by adults. So for example, this is just a very, very, very minor selection of images that are tagged with the word children when you Google that word. So these are all images that are culled from internet sources, again, which tag the word children or childhood. Going back to what Vivek mentioned about the camera as a tool of colonization, while it might seem like a stretch, these millions of photos produced by adults suggest a kind of colonization of childhoods by adults. So children are photographed oftentimes as placeless or timeless and almost stripped of any cultural identities. Or we can also look at an example of mainstream commercial photographers like Ann Geddes, who was popular, at least in the US and in the 1980s and 90s. She took photos of babies adorned as crustaceans, or it was newborns nestled on lily pads. And this, paired with holiday cards trends, again, at least in the US, means that that photos of and the ideas about children that we have come at us in all sorts of ways. It comes at us through the internet, through our mailboxes, our phones. We are just inundated with photos of children. Patricia Holland, who's a photo historian, reminds us that children and youth suffer the indignity of being unable to present themselves as they would want to be seen, or indeed of even considering how they might want to be seen. Children and youth, we believe, do have things to say about themselves and their worlds from their own perspectives. As Thompson writes, there is no biological truth to suggest that being young equates with nothing to say. So Vivek and I are really interested in what children and youth have to say. We recognize that being adults ourselves limits our capacities to really hear children, to perceive children, to understand children and young people. And we join artists and adults like Wendy Ewald, who work with young people to voice themselves through visual media. So this image here, for example, is from Ewald's text, "The Best Part of Me." Children talk about their bodies in pictures. That's the whole title. And in this work, she works with youth to intervene on photographs that she's made of them in order to convey their capacities and how they see themselves. There are other instances of Ewald's work where she's given young people cameras, much like the visual sociologist Wendy Luttrell, whose work inspires my own. This image is from Luttrell's archive of photos made by young people across a decade of research with her. I build on Luttrell's work by giving young people ages 2 to 5 cameras. This is an image produced by a 4-year-old, for example, of time at a Diwali festival in New Jersey, in the United States. I want to take a step back, however, before telling you about my methods and analysis, to just give you a sense of how Vivek and I more or less conceptualize of images, because it's important to how we frame our methodology. So photographs in our work are objects with communicative and symbolic properties. So they're objects that are made by young people and children, and that they say something. But what is said is, and those meanings embedded in those images are destabilized over time and space, so that what we might understand by an image in one instance could change or become layered over the course of time, depending on where, when, or how the image is viewed again. So photographs are embedded within very specific sociocultural contexts, not only in the moments that those images are made, but also in the moments that they're viewed and narrated across time and space. And all of this allows us to see how identities are co-constituted and negotiated across time and space. Ultimately, in both of our work, we're interested in what children and youth have to say about who they are. So in all their complexities, rather than what adults have to say about them. So I use Wendy Luttrell's collaborative seeing approach to guide my work with young children. This approach involves multiple phases of research with young children's participation. So I'm just going to walk you through the phases using some images from the research itself. So first, children make images. They take turns with a Kodak Pix Pro camera and a 75 megabyte card, or not 75, 256 megabyte memory card. So they take turns with the digital camera. They spend as much time with it as they need to either finish the memory card out, or when they feel like they're finished, they bring it back to me to print out the photos. And from there, we engage in an auto-driven photo elicitation interview. That's a concept by Clark, and that will be in the reference list that we'll provide. And an auto-driven elicitation interview is one where the child drives the research itself. It's hard to be the person managing the interview when you're an adult with a 3-year-old. So the 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds are often kind of driving that interview. They decide which images they want to talk about and which images they want to stop on, or which images they want to pass up and not talk about. At the end of that interview is where they choose 5 photographs that they would like to share with their peers in the classroom. And it's deliberately with their own classroom peers because they have their own community, their own cultural community. And so they are able to kind of speak to each other's images or add on meaning or question. And I'll tell you in a second why there are these multiple phases. And then the images are then put into motion in the classroom, meaning we curate them together in photo books. So at the top right image is one of the children curating his own photo album. It's much like, our social media feeds where we might add and delete photos. Children are doing the same in this case. And those books are kept in the classroom, and they're often pulled out for the children to look at and tell more stories about those photographs. So these phases are really important for a number of reasons. First, they provide multiple instances when children can opt in and out of research. So they are ways of gaining assent from the children. Second is that these instances allow for children to perform and negotiate their identities through the pictures. They may say one thing to me in the photo elicitation interview and another thing to their peers about the same image. And it's my work to hold both meanings at once, not to necessarily suss out what's true or what the essence of who they are is. Finally, the last 2 phases, the focus group or the group meetings and the engagement with images in the classroom are to provide a space for the children to be in conversation and to guide one another, because really children are the experts at being children. They are much better at asking each other questions than I am, and using words and phrases that are very specific to their cultural community. So in my work across both 2 studies with young children, I've had 18 young children make 1,002 photographs. What's important is that they're selecting their own photos. So the 95 photographs that the children select to share with their peers, among others that they emphasize through talk or gestures, pauses, through affect, are what hold weight. So the 1,002 images are one thing, but it's the images that get their attention, that spark conversation or laughter, or where they point at it, and or sometimes they will run their fingers along an image. Those are the images that I pay attention to as a starting point for analysis. They're the ones that I spend more time with. Research with photographs requires what Luttrell calls a need to know more stance. So of course, that means that they need to go through a process of analysis. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about analysis of one image, just to give you a sense of how one photograph already is embedded within layers of meaning and significance. So on this slide is a short list of approaches that one might take to analyze a photograph. They're drawn from the visual and narrative scholars that you see above: Banks, Gilligan, Rose, and Tinkler. So the first is a visual content analysis, which is a pretty straightforward way to look at visual data. So it's that process of counting what's visible in a photograph, particularly if it relates to your research question. So I'll give you an example. A study of children's literacies at home might involve children making photos at home and bringing it back to the researcher, who may then do a count of the literacy text that the researcher sees within the image. Of course, this is very likely, I hope it's not the only thing the researcher would do with the image, as it would be a fairly limited account of what it means to be literate or what the children's literacy practices are. So we'd probably want to know which texts children really engage with, how, with whom. So the visual content analysis really gives us one way to look at a photograph. Another approach, the second on the list, and I just want to point out that these approaches can be integrated with each other, and as I talk about mine, I hope you see that integration. But the second approach is what I've done, what I do often is to describe photos with painstaking attention, as Bolton and colleagues would say, to, quote, name everything that is seen with the object of making the taken for granted rise to the surface, breaking down the privileging of the central image or object of focus. This practice allows us to potentially see or sense objects and relationships that we might not otherwise. So for example, the image of the My Little Pony, at the Diwali festival with the My Little Pony in the foreground that I showed you earlier, the adult impulse for that would be to focus on that stuffed animal. But when I think about how the child, Saryu in this case, talked about the image, and especially in relationship to other images around it, it had much more to do with the celebration of Diwali and her family trip to the party than it had necessarily to do with that stuffed animal. A third approach is the idea of coding themes, both inductively and deductively, as you would do in a narrative analysis. Finally, and again, these are not the only approaches, one might engage in a narrative analysis a la Marcus Banks' idea that you're looking at the internal and external narratives of a photograph, both what's inside the image and what's external to it. So meaning how, when, where it's produced, what images are alongside it, what narratives are told when the image is viewed, again, across different spaces. So if that My Little Pony photo was discussed, or the Diwali photo was discussed in multiple ways across time and space, then that adds to the external narrative of that photo. So this photo here was also taken by Saryu, and it was one of 75 images that she made in the research with me. So I could do a visual content analysis and note the computers, the laptops, the writing materials on the desk, the stuffed animal. I'll give you a second just to look at that before I move forward. So again, if I were to do a visual content analysis to do a count of what's there, it would seem that the digital and the literacy texts kind of, outweigh the actual elephant in the room, which is that stuffed animal. And so what I do with a photo like this is I will write a full annotated description of the image, as I typically would do with images that children select. It's in that description, that painstaking attention to what's there, is that I can actually detail the internal narrative of the image, what's there, as well as what questions may still linger. So Vivek, can you move on to the next slide? Thank you. So the internal narrative includes the stuffed animal, which is a childhood object. If I'm thinking about what's not there, the child and the adult, there's no person in the image. I do also have questions around, whether the photo was potentially posed. And then I can note things like the computer, the laptop, and the writing pads. The external narrative, on the other hand, is what Sarayu has narrated about the photograph, as well as what I can determine based on where it is in the series of images that she took. So Sarayu had explained that this image was made while she sat in her dad's office on a Saturday morning. And she said that the stuffed animal's name is Kitty Catty. Kitty Catty is in Daddy's work, but did not work, she explained to me. When I asked what Kitty Catty was doing, Sarayu noted that the cat was just, quote, sniffing the ground, while Sarayu was just, quote, looking at the laptop. It's not only the words that Sarayu uses in telling me about this image, but also how she talked about the image. So she pointed at it, she had a specific tone of voice, which actually she uses when she talks about her dad. So across the photo elicitation interview, anytime dad came up, whether it be dad's workspace or an actual photo of dad, she would, her affect would notably change. It would become more high pitched, she would be more excited. So those are the things that are important for me to attend to. And then I have to zoom out. So this is the bottom part of this slide, zoom out to think about how Sarayu's sociocultural context plays a role in this, how this image is made. So Sarayu is an only child, which means that she does spend a lot of time with her parents, including at work, given the ways that hours of work and labor, especially for those of us in America, have extended way beyond the typical 8 to 5, Monday through Fridays. So that, again, just to remind us, this is on a Saturday morning and she's at work with her dad. And then to add to that, there's this proliferation of digital technologies that has contributed to that extension of work, as well as the ways that we have to attend to multiple tasks at once, the multiple screens that are at play there. So I've spent time thinking, about analysis of one image, but of course there are approaches to analyzing multiple images, which I would do. And in the case of this image, I'm looking not just at Sarayu's other images, but also images made by other children that may have similar external narratives. So this is, for example, Sarayu's image of going to work with dad made me look at other similar kinds of images that the children across both studies made, which actually were not uncommon, especially for the children to emphasize in their interviews. So the left-hand side of this slide has an image that Sarayu took of her father, and again, engaging in work, but this time it's a simultaneous work and labor. I think something that many of us may be familiar with, that multitasking. Jalen spoke at length about, Jalen is the child in the middle, spoke at length about his mother doing work every night while he sat by her. And then Cindy on the right-hand side, who was actually a child from a different study, made an image of her parents' work as well. So these images are just a glimpse into children's childhoods. And to really think further about this, just to give you a little bit more information, all of these images, at least on this screen, were made by only children without siblings, who are also children of color, or who are from non-dominant backgrounds. So these can really be points of inquiry for us into thinking about which childhoods for which children. I'm going to hand it back to Vivek.
Thank you, Tran. And that photograph that Sarayu has of somebody in a family sitting on the couch and working definitely also reminds me of this COVID life that all of us are still living very much, and those boundaries of work and home. So thank you. It's always amazing to see these photographs from young children and all the things that you bring to it too. So I'm going to transition just a little bit, talking about my own work. Tran's work has been deeply influential in shaping my own work with photographs and photography and young people. I'm going to share a snippet from a project that I've worked on a couple of years ago with a young photographer, and the subtitle of this section is called Rethinking Image and Text, Methodological Explorations with a young photographer. So before I get into the project, something that I'm definitely interested in is thinking about the relationship between image and text, not only in research, but also in our sort of everyday life. Oftentimes, the text sort of emerges from the image. It could be in the form of an interview, a survey, or other forms of data, or even in newspapers and magazines where when an image is present, it leads to some text. But what I've noticed is that oftentimes that relationship is overpowered by the text, where the text then comes to describe and define the image in sort of sometimes definitive and concrete ways. This is also very evident in qualitative research, where because of the nature of academic journals, one is expected to convert image-based work into print-based textual work. But that relationship between the image and text is one that is complicated, in my opinion. John Berger and Jean Moore talk about how all photographs are essentially ambiguous, that they've been taken out of some sort of continuity, but yet this ambiguity is not obvious in their words. For as soon as photographs are used with words, they produce an affect of certainty, even of dogmatic assertion. So when I think about how images are circulated in our everyday lives, the text is provided as a way to give confirmation or to stress on how to read and understand that image. I have been following Teju Kole's work. He's a photographer and a writer, somebody who's thinking about the relationship between image and text. In a book that came out a couple of years ago called Blind Spot, Teju Kole was experimenting between the relationship between the text and the image. The book is basically a collection of photographs and text, one being on the recto side of the page, one being on the verso side of the page. And what is interesting about this text is the relationship that it was creating between the text and the image. Each of those images by themselves, people might not consider it to be remarkable, quote unquote, but when read with the text, sort of created some interesting relationships. So this image had the following text, which I will read. We can imagine optical illusions because we have experienced them. Moral illusions are more difficult to imagine, but are no less real. Moral situations arise in which we are unable to correctly interpret the information in front of us. You might see a map of a bombing raid, for instance, with the note, each dot represents 500 people, and proceed thereafter to enjoy a nice lunch or a piece of music. I'm reading Teju Kole's words from the book, and there's a couple of sentences, but to me, what this pairing of image and text that Teju Kole is doing creates an interesting tension between what the text and the image are supposed to do in relationship with each other, which is rather than offering necessarily confirmation, are providing different lines of thought that go out in different directions. So in my work, I was interested in exploring visual methodology, specifically this relationship between image and text as we think about it, with a young photographer named Urja. Urja, when I started working with her, was 13 years old. And after deciding, asking her and her deciding that she would be interested in doing this, my only prompt to her was about making photographs. We decided to meet weekly or fortnightly based on her schedules, because also now young people are so busy with everything that's expected of them. And during our meetings, we would have fairly unstructured interviews, using her photographs as a starting point to think about what she was creating and how she wanted to talk about it. Over the course of 1 year, during which we collaborated, Urja created close to 300 photographs. As I was thinking about this methodological approach, I draw on a lot of scholars who question visual methodology, both thinking about the power that it has, but also some of its challenges and limitations. Alan, who talks about how we approach visual methodology is as important as the methods we use, talks about the fact that the method is not necessarily empowering in and of itself, but it's the negotiation between the researcher and the participant where the power and the possibilities of the method emerge. So thinking about what Alan had said, I decided to give Urja a digital camera just to treat her as somebody who is capable of producing images and narrating her own images. So in this instance, I was drawing on Wendy Luttrell, Tran Templeton, and Arjun Shankar's work that tries to incorporate young people as producers, interpreters, circulators, and also analyzers of their own images, that they are the ones who are making these, they're the ones who understand these, and they're the ones who can talk about these. And as I was thinking about this question of analysis, and Tran walked us through this, her beautiful sort of approach to analysis, I was also thinking about how do we analyze images in a way that doesn't necessarily grade them only into textual fragments. Fendler reminds us that if we read images with the same skills we use to read words, we will not be able to see what images are and what they do. So in a moment of sort of a methodological, quote unquote, stuckness, not knowing how to analyze Urja's images, I decided to experiment a little bit with my own sort of methodological approach. So instead of analyzing them in a traditional way, I decided to write short vignettes that were based on Urja's descriptions of her own images through our interviews and conversations, and also conversations that she and I were having both as people of South Asian origin, having lived in multiple countries, and then some of these conversations about life and family. So the conversations were meandering all over the place, from the image to our lives to other things. And so I created these vignettes, and not knowing how to pair the image and text, I returned the text to Urja and asked her to play with the pairing of the image and text. In this process, we came up with these idea of photo vignettes, where I started writing the text, and then Urja started experimenting with how to pair the image and text and how to think about that relationship. This was an interesting moment of collaboration, especially as we think about Azuli's argument that photography is always collaborative in nature, in the sense that even though we think of photographers as individual people creating work in their own silos, it's never that they're working by themselves. They're always in dialogue with other people, their subjects, objects, and other beings that they're photographing. And so Azuli's reminder is also not simply about how we can engage other people in the act of photography or the event of photography, but also how the photographer themselves engage with the process of photography. So along this experimentation of creating photo vignettes and exchanging them with each other, Urja decided to write her own vignettes. She said to me, Vivek, I want to do my own writing. I want to explore how writing and image go together, which was great for me that she wanted to think about that. And she started experimenting also with the pairing of these images and text. So what you're seeing on the screen is a makeshift sort of gallery space that Urja created in her living room and started experimenting with how to pair images and text. Going back to what Tran said about how these meanings change over space and time, Urja, over the course of our interaction over the year, would change her pairings many times over. And sometimes the image would stay and the text would change. Sometimes the image changed and the text would stay. And sometimes both of those things changed. In one of our conversations, Urja said, and I'm quoting her here, some of them, the photo vignettes, I changed my mind. You know, you post something on Instagram, you look at it 2 months later and you're like, why did I ever do that? This is an interesting moment for both of us to reflect on this process of how images, how we respond to images and think about images, but also what roles they play in our lives. And I'm sure many of us have had this experience either with Instagram or just looking at photographs on our own sort of camera roll, where maybe Urja is being a little too harsh with herself in this moment, but we've definitely had that moment where we go back and look at a photograph and we're like either looking at it with endearment or questioning a particular image and why we do that. So her reflection here is a reminder that all of us already do this sort of an engagement with images, where our affinities and engagements with it are changing. So having done this work for a year, Uja and I got into conversation about how to share this work. And my role interestingly shifted from being a researcher to becoming more of a curatorial assistant and a collaborator. And I was thinking and exploring alongside Uja's experimentation with image and text. And so Uja then decided that instead of only writing about this work, we would actually do a small exhibition at a coffee shop in a small Midwestern town where both of us lived at that time. And so Uja and I decided to create the show. And I wrote the curatorial essay for this show that was up in the coffee shop for about 6 months. And the show was called Thinking Through a Camera, a title that both Uja and I came up with. So I want to end by showing you two of Uja's images and reading the text that she wrote that accompanies those images. And this introduction to the exhibition is something that I wrote, and I'll just read that out for you. In Thinking Through a Camera, Uja Devesar takes you on a visual journey. The photographs in the series are of everyday objects and scenes, signage inside a school bus, or a flowering bush outside an apartment complex. Uja artfully combines these images with meditative prose. As a viewer, you're not allowed to settle with what is seen in the photographs. The writing transports you to a different scene, a memory of an event, or a glimpse into Uja's thoughts. While offering this intimate look into her life, Uja's work also reminds us that photographs are not fixed in their meanings. Photographs don't just record reality, they push us to think, remember, and feel. So this is one of the images that Uja had selected to show in the exhibition, and I'll read the text accompanying it, which is written by Uja. Sometimes it is difficult to explain to people how hard it was and how fast it became easy. When I moved back to the US after 2 years of living in India, I was lost in the place I'd known before. Yet, I had no clue how it became so. I'd often try to recall old parts of my life. I tried to remember these things so I could possibly fit in. When I walk around, ideas usually come to me. At first, I found this unusual. One day, I saw this beautiful set of sunflowers. To me, it was this fragile thing, so beautiful and bright, yet no one had admired it quite the way I did. I bent down slowly and took a picture with my camera. At this time in my life, writing and photography were my outlets. It helped me to understand parts of myself and feelings I had. So I wrote. I wrote about a single sunflower for 3 hours straight with ideas flowing through my head of how this flower can mean something to me. It wasn't just the moment or the photograph, it's what the picture made me feel. It pushed me to remember the time in 2010 when I got off the plane in Delhi and I saw my grandfather holding a vibrant set of sunflowers. And so just to sort of end on this question, some of the work with Uja has helped me think about visual methodologies, but also think about how do we engage the multiplicities of photographic practice through our own sort of theoretical and methodological approaches. And just something that reminds us that photography has so many possibilities that there's really room for us to experiment and explore. Thank you.
So we're going to try to wrap up really quickly with just some provocations for us. So in thinking about visual research, we really want to think about how the fact that we can never really fully remove ourselves from the research as we play a role in facilitating it. And I always appreciate how Vivek talks about his work and the care that he gives to the youth's work and his role in it. And so that's really important for us to think about whose images, whose gaze, whose stories, because as Marjorie Oriana reminds us, the human eye is positioned at many different heights and its inclinations are shaped by social context. So That's not just literal, but it's also metaphorical if we consider that we all hold unique positions in the world and our ways of seeing and knowing are shaped by that. And perhaps more or differently from other research, visual research requires us to have this need to know more stance that Luttrell posits. And especially at a time like this, when we've got fake news and deep fakes and other easily manipulable forms of media, a time when we really should be asking more about the images. At the same time, we have to be thinking, especially when it comes to our role as researchers, what right do we have to know? So both Vivek and I think about this question all the time. Are these our stories to tell? And in some cases, our participants make it very clear a child might move away from me as they narrate their photos to a peer. So Eve Tuck has written about refusal in photo voice research. We want to just mention her work because she has been really pivotal in helping us think about this notion of refusal, how research questions are developed in a way that gets at what researchers want to know, and that there are ethical quandaries to consider when we think about what becomes of images, where they're viewed, and we might add who benefits from that research. Refusal in Tuck's work, as well as the work of other Indigenous scholars like Audra Simpson and Sandy Grande, is an act of sovereignty. It's a way to take back authorial power, to not give everything away. And as researchers, we have to think, do we also, give everything away or try to take everything? Finally, when we think back to that timeline that Vivek shared with us, we're operating in a time like right now where cameras are much more readily available and accessible. Like TikTok, YouTube, Instagram is giving children, these applications are giving children ways of taking back their narratives, right? Tools of self-expression. And we revel in that, the fact that children and youth have more and more access to fashion, refashion themselves. But we also want to think about other forces at play that suggests that perhaps the camera is not the only force or object at work, that children are not only at the mercy of researchers and researcher agendas, but in an age of social media, they're also producing themselves for social norms, algorithms, and for the attention economy. And that gets us to think about and try to understand that the content of the photo is more than we can say. So it's not that a photo can just be captured, and as Sontag says, strictly speaking, one never understands anything from a photograph. So it might seem ironic that we came onto this webinar to articulate processes of visual meaning making, just to end by saying we can never fully know what an image means. The image itself is an object that both gives and resists. And we want to leave you with a question that John Berger might also pose, which is, how can you as a researcher linger in that unsettled space between seeing and knowing? Thank you so much for joining us. We do have our contact information here because we do realize that we cut it really close to the final minute, and we welcome you to contact us should you have any questions about anything we presented.
Thank you both, Tran and Vivek, so much. We've got someone wanting to ask a live question, Carlene. Andrea, are you able to give Carlene voice access?
1 second, please. Gonna look right now. Yes. Yes.
Carlene, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, please. Your question.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for an incredibly mind-boggling conversation today. What I really appreciated was the processes that each of the speakers talked us through. But what I'm curious to ask is, with most ethics boards, and especially in South Africa and Botswana, you have to preemptively stipulate exactly what you're going to be doing, when and how. And it seems that there's quite an emerging process going on as well. How do you account for that, and what recommendations would you have in writing some of the possibilities into ethics applications? Thank you.
Tran, I think you might be the better person to answer that question.
I mean, actually haven't had too many obstacles when it comes to IRB. I'm happy to share also the consent forms for parents and how, because I lay out exactly what I'll say to the children, and of course in the moment it may be thrown off path, but I have a good idea of what I will say to children, and then I have a interview protocol with the children. Yeah, I mean, is it, Carlene, the idea of the images that IRBs, you feel like IRB would push back on?
Images especially, there's loads of loopholes to jump through, but then not just the use of images, but the use of analysis that seems to progress depending on the participant, whereas most institutional bodies here prefer to know exactly what you're going to be doing, and they're very strict, like don't deviate from the plan. So we write quite a broad plan.
Yes, that's what I do too, right.
And then you kind of hope that one of those broad ideas is going to cover every aspect. And if it doesn't, you can always submit a request for deviating from the plan. But especially with children's research, I think your willingness to share the parent status and the informed consents would be really helpful.
Sure, yeah, you can just send me an email and I'm happy to do that. Vivek, do you have anything to say about that sort of?
I need to jump in.
Okay.
We're unfortunately coming very close to our end time. Obviously, there's much interest. We've seen a lot of thank yous in the chat. Folks that are going to be looking at the recordings and at your slides when we're able to get them up on our archive site. I'm going to very quickly, if I could ask you to stop sharing your screen for a second, I'd like to mention we've got a couple more presentations coming up in November for anyone who has interest. We've got Dr. Selena Richter and Kimberly Jarvis next week, conducting qualitative research in international contexts. Dr. Robert Kozenek's immersion in social media research, the ethnographic path. We're definitely covering a span. I do encourage anyone who has further questions to reach out to Vivek and Tran, as they have encouraged you to do today. Wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. I want to thank ATLAS as well, and Indiana University always for their ongoing participation, and you'll see we've got our website there. Please check out our archive, and we look forward to seeing all of you again in another Insights or Explorations webinar coming up very soon. Again, thank you to ATLAS, thank you Tran, and thank you Vivek.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and really appreciate people joining in from all parts of the world. And thank you, Juliana and Andrea, for making this really easy and pleasurable for Tran and me to share this work. Thank you all.
Yes, agreed. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And again, thank you for attending today. I echo that as well. Have a wonderful and safe week. Take care, everyone.